Opium was the one thing that the Chinese did not have and did want in large quantities. And once the British discovered that the Chinese needed the opium and that they had supplies of it in India, an area like here, at the foot of the Straits of Malacca, turning round into the South China Sea, became very important in their eyes.
The East India Company was producing opium in northern India and shipping it to China, where it was used to buy supplies of tea, which could then be sent back to England. It was the company's most profitable trade route, but every one of its ships had to pass through a narrow passage known as the Malacca Straits. To protect its interests, the company wanted to set up a port somewhere at the foot of the Malacca Straits. But there was a problem. For 200 years, the Dutch had controlled the East Indies. They were the military and economic superpower in the region, and it was company policy to do nothing which might upset them. Raffles' expedition to Singapore was deliberately provocative. He was an official of the company and had been told to tread very carefully. No one expected him to set up a port under the very noses of the Dutch.
Company, salute!
Whenever he talked about furthering British ambitions east of Calcutta, everyone said, let's leave it as it is, don't rock the boat, you know, the Dutch aren't going to like it. And Raffles thought, well, to hell with the Dutch, I like it, and I'm going to do it, and he did.
2 weeks after Raffles raised the British flag over Singapore, news reached his boss, Charles Bannerman, the governor of Penang. Bannerman didn't like or trust the ambitious young Raffles and was furious that one of his men had breached company policy. He urgently contacted his Dutch counterparts to assure them that Raffles had been acting on his own initiative, without the authority of the company.
He was very effusive and said, very sorry, we'll call the man back. He was quite out of order, and I'm sure you needn't worry about him being there for very long.
Bannerman's assurances stopped the Dutch from invading Singapore. They simply waited for the British to pull out. But Bannerman hadn't accounted for the mood back in London. The recent Napoleonic Wars had seen an upsurge in military pride and a greater sense of national defiance. Rather than giving in to the Dutch over Singapore, word was sent to Bannerman that Raffles should be allowed to stay put.
It was great brouhaha back in Europe. In the end, the dust died down, and after a few years, it was a fait accompli. The Dutch weren't going to do anything about it.
Raffles realized that for Singapore to survive, it needed to be more than a stopover between India and China, and become a port in its own right, attracting trade from across the region. But how could he persuade traders to come to his new settlement?
This whole region was full of traders all over the place. There are many river mouths, small ports. So what Raffles did was to provide them with a place where they could come and trade freely. By providing that service, the word got around very, very quickly, and all these people realized that this was a tremendous advantage. They brought all their trade to Singapore. They could bring in all kinds of goods, sell almost anything they could get without having to pay taxes. And there was just nothing like that anywhere else in Asia.
This was Raffles' big idea, free trade. It was the bait that would lure traders away from other ports in the region and make Singapore their base.
Raffles realized Singapore could become the center of a regional trade and tap into the vast production base of the East Indies. the bird's nest from Borneo, and camphor, and resins from the jungle, which were used for lacquer, very important for China, of course. Gold dust from Bali. And then, of course, there's the main thoroughfare, the east-west trade route between China and India. One contemporary description of the place said that the ships were coming to Singapore like bees clustering around a honeypot. The place was literally swarming with trade.
Raffles was delighted by the success of his new trading post. He called it his little child. But he was to be an absent father. He was immediately summoned back to Bencoolen, a remote British base in southern Sumatra. His official job was as governor here, and the company insisted he return to his duties. He would be away from his little child for the next 3.5 years. In that time, people flocked to Singapore. And their descendants still populate the island today. A large Chinese community had already been living and trading along the Malacca Straits for centuries. Many simply moved to Singapore to enjoy the benefits of free trade. Others came direct from mainland China to escape the hardships of Manchu rule. Indians also came as traders. But more often they were soldiers and civil servants already well versed in the ways of the British Empire. Today, the Indian community still preserves ancient traditions from the homeland. Traditions which have disappeared in India itself. And Singapore's other great community, then and now, were the Malays. A few, like Othman Wok's great-grandfather, were sea gypsies, already living on the island. But the vast majority came from elsewhere across the Malay archipelago. They came to make money, but also to worship freely. From the very beginning, religious tolerance was part of the ethos of multi-ethnic Singapore. This is the oldest surviving sketch of the emerging settlement, drawn by one of the British officers. Within just 4 years, 10,000 people had set up home here. Raffles had left his old friend William Farquhar in charge. He had lived in the region for many years and had a very relaxed attitude to what he called local customs. Slave trading was allowed. Gambling was commonplace. Even cockfighting, which Raffles despised. Farquhar also did nothing to stop the spread of opium. This drug the British had promoted within China was fast becoming an addiction among Chinese workers in Singapore.